one more important thing, the absolutization of serving the American interest. Europe serves the American geopolitical interests because Europe fears that it has become too soft or it lost the power to control the world. So Europe gave up itself under the United States. The US is capable of controlling the world, so we will serve the US to control the world and get from the big feast of the Americans some dropouts from the table. From the big American feasting table, Europe will get some small drops or some small pieces of food. That's the general approach.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to a former Hungarian diplomat, His Excellency Ambassador Sandor Zoltan Kusai. Ambassador Kusai served his country in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister's office in various capacities. Most importantly, he spent a total of 18 years in China, including in the top position as ambassador between 2008 and 2014. He's now working as a scholar in research and education back home in Hungary, and it's a pleasure having him here today. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
I'm glad you said yes, because we discussed a little bit via email that we want or should look at the role of China and Europe's diplomacy / non-diplomacy toward it, anti-diplomacy, depending on how you want to see it. You've had so much experience with that country, and you represented a European state there. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and the general assessment of where European diplomacy with China is headed?
It is heading into a wrong direction. Europe is misunderstanding China, but I am convinced that Europe is deliberately misunderstanding China. It's not just by mistake, it's a deliberate act. And the Chinese getting more and more impatient, I would say, with Europe. They hope that Europe can turn into a better direction, but I see in the latest developments that the Chinese are gradually losing their patience. They are full of distress and dislike what they see from Europe. All the trying of misleading China or taking advantage of certain economic and political factors. So it's very, I would say, clear that Europe does not want to have good relations with China. Europe now openly wants a regime change in China by diplomacy or by political pressure and economic pressure. That's the fact, and it's so understandable and clear that it simply undermines the basic trust which could lie under the cooperation. That's my assessment of the present situation.
Can you give us examples of that? I mean, what in what way does the European Union or does Europe signal to China that they want regime change, and when did that start?
The second part of your question is easier. I think it started in the mid-70s when the official diplomatic relations was established. But it was more covered up and not so simple and pressuring attitude, because Europe had fundamental economic interests in trading with China. The change by trade policy of Germany was very important. So they wanted to change China all the time, but it was for the first 3 decades, it was simply a hope, an illusion that by trading, by influencing the economic development of China, by helping the Chinese middle class to grow, to develop, it will change China by itself. It was an illusion. We saw it in the early 2000s, after 2011. We saw it very clearly that it's an illusion. But on the other hand, the Chinese had always another illusion. The Chinese had an illusion that Europe can become a simple or a single separate individual pole in the global economy and in the global politics. So the Europeans had the illusion that the strategic autonomy of Europe, which was later formulated by President Macron, is a reality or is a possibility. I think nowadays it's very clear that it is impossible. So what we see now is a mutual disillusionment, both from Europe and from China. And the consequences are really very bad. First and foremost, for the smaller European countries like Hungary is.
How does that work though? Like, the Europe, okay, we have the European Union, and yes, the EU is a bloc, but on a diplomatic level, it's still each member state that has direct diplomatic contact with other countries. Yes, you have a common foreign and security policy, but the EU member states are in this in between zone, and diplomacy still, at least on paper, happens on a national level. So when you were ambassador there, I mean, what were your competences? What did Hungary do directly with China, and where were you undercut by, like, let's say, forces from Brussels?
We could have bilateral cultural investment activities. You could represent your country, your government. I did it for 6 years, beginning from a socialist government and ending with the present center-right government. So I was a professional diplomat. So I worked with any possible government which people might have elected in Hungary for more than 30 years. So I know how it works. So I had the basic task, which is, by the way, the basic task of diplomacy in principle, according to the Vienna Convention, is to help developing bilateral trade, bilateral relations, to realize your country's national interest via cooperation. That's the basic why the whole Vienna Convention and diplomacy and the diplomatic relations were built originally. But at present, it is very difficult to continue that. And with regard, I was ambassador when Hungary has already joined the European Union for 4 years. So I participated in the level of cooperation between EU member states, which meant monthly meeting of the ambassadors, discussions on issues, mainly on the level of the European Union and China relations, but it was always detailed into bilateral relations as well. It was an exchange of information, exchange of our approaches, and so on. It went on once every month on the level of ambassadors, but all the embassies continue that on the level of every diplomat, on press attaches, trade attaches, and so on every aspect of diplomacy. And I had a very interesting experience when I began my ambassadorial work there. It was in 2008. And that was the year of the crisis, of the Great Recession, if you want it. And at that time, at the beginning, and in the first 2 or 2.5 years, our European approach to China was much, much more cooperative because we needed economically China, financially China. Europe couldn't overcome that crisis, that financial crisis, without the active cooperation with China, not only in economic relations, but also in financial matters. So we were very cooperative at that time. And as the crisis, I would say, because I am convinced as an economist that we have never overcome that crisis. Still, the crisis is lingering around us. But anyhow, as we felt better economically, financially, and so on, the Union began to pressure China to press for more political, I would say, more ideological aspects or matters, and it began to sour the relationship. And it was very difficult for an ambassador. Of course, the Hungarian governments, all of them led by different parties, were always for cooperation, for expanding investment, trade, and humanitarian cooperation, education, and so on. We were interested in that because Hungary, as a peripheral country of the European Union, we are on the periphery, economically, socially, cultural, in every aspect. We needed extra, I would say, impetus from the world for economic development, for social development. The European Union has troubles. There is no chance for selling twice as much Hungarian products in Europe as we sold last year. It's simply impossible because the European market is not expanding, especially now, but it didn't expand in the best years. I remember that was 3-4% growth maximum. So we needed extra cooperation outside the European Union. And if you think back to those years of global economic globalization, which was the single most important growing economy in the world, which was the strongest market, the upcoming new technologies, the upcoming new partnerships, the upcoming new investments. It was China. So that's why the Hungarian China opening policy, which was called at that time, began in 2003, and it got very, very impressive after 2010, the present government formation at the first time, because it was simply a very, very simple and understandable economic interest. And that moved us. So I had to balance the European pressures and the national interests. It went through investments like Huawei, like the battery factories. Now it's about the electric car factories and so on. I had to promote them. On the other hand, I had to manage the background with the European Union in the background, convince my colleagues that it is not dangerous when any Chinese company invests in Hungary. It was not easy sometimes.
I believe that, but where is this fear and distrust also coming from? On the one hand, I do understand that uh, that there are deep-seated European distrust toward socialist China. But then again, I mean, in the 2000s and 2010s, communism wasn't the topic anymore, right? Communism is what Europe overcame, and of course, you are Hungary. I mean, you were a communist Hungary, socialist Hungary, right? And that was left behind, at least like rhetorically, ideologically. So where did come from that the Europeans still thought that the Chinese are out to somehow come and get them? Um, And because, like, Switzerland is the country, Switzerland is the country that had the first free trade agreement with China, and that was very much also a model case for the EU. And this free trade relations actually helped both. They helped Switzerland and the Chinese. They liked the Swiss market, and also as an example case. Can you maybe speak to that a bit?
I think for the distrust on the European side is a deep-rooted ideological stubbornness, I would say. The European politicians in most of the countries and the European scholars studying China simply stayed in the 60s and 70s in their minds. They simply don't understand that that, as the Chinese call it, the socialism with Chinese characteristics. In that formula, the Chinese characteristics puts the limitation on socialism. It's a mixed economy, a mixed social structure, and a mixed political structure. For the economy, the European scholars and even the European politicians could understand much easier the capitalist elements, the private ownership, the private entrepreneurship in China. They very often overestimated the importance of it. But in social policies, and especially in the political sphere, they could not understand the restructuring of the Chinese Communist Party, which originally was a classical communist party based on Leninism and so on, organizational structure and policies and everything. But nowadays it's a different party. It does not mean that it is a liberal party. No, it's still, I would say, etatist party with very strong purpose of moving forward the rebirth of the Chinese state technologically, economically, and so on, and which is ready to use every possible means, including capitalism, to reach that purpose, to reach that target. And they are doing that. So it's a much more structured entity, the Chinese Communist Party, than most of the European analysts think. And as you know, it is common in every foreign policy issue. The analysts are much better than the politicians are. The politicians are stubborn-headed, undereducated people. That's how I would say the present form of parliamentary democracy works. You become a successful politician, even you may get some government positions, even premiership or presidency, only if you fully in compliance with the lowest level of the understanding of the electorate. So the electorate, you must diverge to the, or converge to the lowest level of the average. And that makes politicians very stubborn, very undereducated, and very single-minded in ideological issues. When you have a problem with your scholarship, analytical background, which at least lags behind for 20, 25 years or more, then it will extrapolate into even more stubborn political approach. That's what we see in Europe now.
May I just ask about your personal also perception, because you have this special case having yourself like grown up under a socialist system and go into the public service under a socialist system, and then going through the 1990s and 2000s, and then go to socialist China, or what today is socialism with Chinese characteristics. Do you recognize what you see in China, the social system, with what you remember from Hungary, how it used to be, or are those different worlds?
Some elements I do recognize. Hungary was the happiest barrack in the socialist camp because Hungary had an early reform experience from the late 60s during the 70s, much less in the 80s. But there were economic reforms. There were some space for private initiative in the economy, even in some social aspects and so on. So the Chinese, before they began the reform process in 79, they studied, and even during the 80s, they studied the Hungarian so-called reform experience. So I saw, especially during my first posting in China, which was in the second half of the 1980s, I saw a lot of similar things there. But there was a turning point. In 1990, practically 1989, 1990, 1991, Hungary and most of the Central and Eastern European former communist states decided to turn totally into the liberal parliamentary democracy with market economy and so on, to the Western model. That was a full turn. In China, after the crisis of 1989, you remember the Tiananmen Square events and so on. I was there, by the way, at that time. I had my first political conflict experience in practice as a diplomat there. So China went on a different path. China did not resign the reform, but China understood on the experience of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union that if they embrace the Western model, the party will lose power sooner or later. And that was the switch, I think. So the Chinese Communist Party decided to keep the power, but continue the reform. So Chinese Communist Party began to reform itself. It was in the mid-1990s when everybody was allowed into the party, including private entrepreneurs, including even the richest people. Can you imagine a communist party in the 60s or the 50s, or in, let's say, earlier in the last century, which would embrace the largest capitalist in its party? It was impossible. It stabilized the Communist Party. It made it capable of integrating interests, different interests of different social groups into one political structure. It's much more complicated than if you have it in an open party competition system. In the open party competition system, you have different parties supported by different social groups. They compete. We have a big ritual. We call it elections. During that big ritual event, some party wins the election and gets the right to form the government, so represent the social background of that party. That's how democracy works. In China, many similar things happen, but they happen within the party. And in the mid-90s, what I am convinced, what stabilized the rule of the Chinese Communist Party in China was that they allowed the party to transform gradually, and they allowed the representatives of different social groups with different interests to enter the party and participate in the party decision making. It does not make it less centralized, but it makes it more receptive to different social needs, political needs of the society. So that made it flexible enough to stay in power when all the ruling communist parties lost power, except, let's say, a few of them, which later followed the Chinese basic principle, this Chinese political structural reform of the party, which is Vietnam, for example, and which is in some different aspects, Laos and Cambodia, so the Indo-Chinese countries, and it is happening now in Cuba as well. So anyhow, I became too scientific. Anyhow, the issue is that we in Europe does not accept this whole situation. We think that the Chinese Communist Party is still the same Communist Party which was led by Mao Zedong. That's why all the analysts, I mean the mainstream, there are a few clever people, but most of the mainstream China analysts in Europe think that Xi Jinping is a reincarnation of Mao Zedong, which is not true, which is a foolish idea. But that concept influences the political decision making, the whole political climate. And that makes Europe's approach to China very, 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 I would say, inadequate, not adequate to the reality. And that is one of the sources of many mistakes and conflicts.
But when I look at the current discourse, the Europeans don't complain about China being communist or being socialist. They don't complain so much about a different social model. They complain about Chinese bullying, about China being an abuser of human rights, about China being aggressive towards others. I mean, they focus on China as China, as Chinese, not as a model, an alternative model, because in a sense, I think the Europeans and also the North Americans, they're over that. I mean, we are already in the post Fukuyama world where everybody believes we made the point. The only reason why China is so successful is because they actually embraced capitalism, right? Without opening. So it's this autocracy. It's the autocracy much more than the social issue. How do you make sense of that?
I think it's a very simple disguise. I wouldn't say it's simple propaganda, because I am convinced that all those European colleagues, they really are convinced that they are right. But the problem is that whenever you criticize China for centralized economic policy, for centralized governmental subsidies for companies which produce breakthrough technologies, which develop breakthrough technologies and so on. So when China intervenes into the simple market mechanism, then we begin to cry. But this approach is an inseparable part of the Chinese political social system. The whole Chinese state based on these policies. So when we attack these policies, we attack the substance of and we know that. So if the Chinese Communist Party would let the free market forces rule, it would be the end of the Chinese Communist Party. And by the way, as the historical experience shows, it would be the end of the fast development of China.
Yes.
Because that society cannot be held together as a functioning mechanism if you don't have a central will of some kind. We see, by the way, this disintegration process. Maybe I am too radical with this assessment, but what we see is the disintegration of the model in the United States because of the limitations of the central organizing power, because of the absolutization of the market mechanisms. And that leads to very, very serious economic, financial, and other consequences. In China, they are trying to avoid it. And when we criticize the human rights, we criticize one of the elements of the substance. But it's very interesting because we have really double standards. I don't remember any European scholar or I mean mainstream scholar, or any European politician criticizing Ukraine for suppressing ethnic minorities. The same European leaders who criticize China for suppressing some ethnic minorities, especially Muslims, Uyghurs, and others, which criticism has some real basis under it. So it's not the criticism does not come from the thin air. But the problem is that I never heard any criticism of the present Ukrainian government, even before the war, for suppressing the ethnic minorities in Ukraine. So it shows very clearly that our criticism is not valid on the basis of principles, but it is a geopolitically motivated approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anyone who has spent some time actually following the diplomacy or the speech acts of the West, even just over the last couple of years, understands that the same people who claim that China is committing a genocide against its Muslim minority are the same people who defend Israel's right to commit a genocide against the Palestinian Muslim majority the country they occupy. But let's leave that aside. I mean, the hypocrisy is the hypocrisy. The one thing that is even harder to understand is why this approach, especially by the Europeans, which is not necessary. I mean, China is no security threat. It's an economic, it's an opportunity. If anything, I mean, if an economic threat, then something that with something as simple as a few tariffs can be managed easily, because even smuggling from China to Europe is not that easy. Why is it? I mean, it's connected, but it's not at the border, right? I mean, you have so much buffer in between. Why is it that Europe currently is proactively making China its enemy?
I think it's some kind of missionistic. We have a mission to really spread all over the world our model, which, by the way, we ourselves know that it's not the most perfect model. We have a lot of problems with this model in our societies, in our economies, and so on. But first of all, Europe, especially for this commission, I mean, the commission headed by Ursula von der Leyen. Before Ursula von der Leyen, it was a much more tactical and diplomatic commission. Now it's a purely ideological, value-based, as they call it, commission with its policies and so on. And the problem with it that we lack the capacity, the power to establish the real influence. China is a great power. We cannot deny it. It's a different civilization, and it's about more than 8,000 kilometers east from us. So it does not pose any immediate threat. It cannot pose and does not pose any immediate geopolitical or economic threat to Europe. That's so simple. But the ideological drive and one more important thing, the absolutization of serving the American interest. Europe serves the American geopolitical interests because Europe fears that it has become too soft or it lost the power to control the world. So Europe gave up itself under the United States. The US is capable of controlling the world, so we will serve the US to control the world and get from the big feast of the Americans some dropouts from the table. From the big American feasting table, Europe will get some small drops or some small pieces of food. That's the general approach. And that led to the death. Practically, I think that the European diplomacy, I mean, on the level of the European Union, but in many countries, member states also, the diplomacy is dead. Can you imagine, just one example, can you imagine that just a few days before leaving for China, for the EU-China summit, which is a yearly event, the president of the European Commission comes out in the European Parliament and barks at China in the undiplomatic, the most undiplomatic way. The entrance is hitting the host. Is it diplomacy? And it becomes a little bit funny even, because if we were the real strong bully, we could do that. When the bully visits the school, it will begin for the poor guys with the first hit. That's the bully's right. That's, by the way, what President Trump does. But when it is done by a weak, unorganized, trembling structure's head, like Madame Ursula, it's terrible. She said, I think, 10 or 15 sentences of really very harsh sentences, criticisms, threats towards China and the Chinese leadership. Then he flies there, and what does she expect? By the way, is it diplomacy? She will begin the negotiations, for example, will she begin the negotiations with, sorry, don't care about what I said in the European Parliament. Please listen to my offer, or what? So that's why I am telling you that it's not diplomacy. It's as you pointed it out, it's anti-diplomacy, what we are doing now.
Can you explain this to yourself? I mean, these people are not the brightest lights in the union, but they're not, they behave like buffoons, but they do have capabilities, right? The one thing that that politicians must have is a feeling for the groups that they move in. Now you get to these top positions, and you even if you vassalize yourself completely under the United States, you still must have some form of feeling for what you are doing. How is it that they are not ashamed of saying something like that and then meeting the counterpart just a few days later? Are they psychologically that kind of lobotomized that they don't understand, that they don't even have feelings about this anymore?
Basically, I agree with you. It's a very good formula. They are psychologically lobotomized. The simple thing is that they grow up in the and climbed up in the political ladder for getting into position, with saying always only that things which got 20,000 likes on the Facebook. And when the negative consequences came, they went out with another statement which got likes. They live in the separate world. They play for the mainstream media. They play for other politicians. They play for the minimalist approach of the general public. And they want 1 or 0.5% better approach from the public for tomorrow, and they don't care what will be the price for it after 3 months, because they are convinced that they will manage any negative influence. They will then come out and say another statement which will be even more radical, again 0.5% increase in their popularity, and so on. And how Europe worked in the last, let's say, 10-15 years, it really works.
It does. It does, but I still struggle to understand what this does to the system. And maybe we can take Kaja Kallas, the high representative for foreign affairs, right? The top diplomat of the EU, the top anti-diplomat. But the fascinating thing is that she got where she is, saying that she is from Estonia, a small former Soviet republic that was suppressed by the Soviet Union, being herself the daughter of a communist functionary, and of course being born as a Soviet citizen, right? And as like on the benefiting end of the Estonian communist party, and she's still able to frame herself then as a brave anti-communist and standing up to socialist China. I mean, why does that work?
I think it's very simple. It responds to the simplified attitude of the general public, or big part of the general public, because the understanding of international relations, of diplomacy among the general public got very low. It got nivelated to the lowest level. That's how our social media run political or ideological or national culture works. It brings everything down to the lowest possible denominator. It's tragic, and that's why they play to that, and they don't understand that in the real world, which is not the internet, not the cyber world, physical world, it may not work. The last meeting between Kaja Kallas, as if you mentioned him, and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi a week ago, I remember. For any student of international studies of the first grade in any university would be a shock when the Chinese foreign minister gives an elementary lecture on national interest, on geopolitics, on great power politics to the head of the European anti-diplomacy. And she does not understand, simply because it does not fit into her understanding of how politicians shall work, how politicians shall present themselves. And it's that. I think it's end of the European diplomacy, and of the art of diplomacy. By the way, I would tell you that the art of diplomacy is a mirror of a real statecraft. And the real problem with the European Union, that the leaders of, and with many member states, I will not name any of them, and I would say even with some other European countries which are not members of the European Union, the death, I wouldn't name it, but it's the death of statecraft, the real statecraft. We don't have statesmen, we don't have statecraft, I mean in philosophical terms, deeply understanding or trying to understand the national interest, the managing of different relations within society, the economy, the culture, that refined or I would say sophisticated approach to society, to politics. We don't have that. And as it dies very fast, I mean the statecraft, the art of managing government, states, unions, and so on, as it is dying out, the diplomacy, the traditional profession, dies with it, because the diplomacy is one of the aspects of the statecraft. We know that from Talleyrand and from all those great diplomats of the past, even including Henry Kissinger, who is not my favorite, but I cannot deny that he was a best professional.
Yeah, he was good at what he did. Unfortunately he used it for things that cost a lot of people's lives. But if we accept that analysis, and we are living in a kakistocratic Europe with kakistocratic diplomacy, that which also makes sense, right? If you have stupid leaders, the stupid leaders would naturally try to foster a very low level kind of just people who just do whatever, like yeah, and no strategic vision, because all you do is look at Facebook and so on, and see of how it chimes. You do echo chamber politics and echo chamber diplomacy. Now, this is the demise of what a good statecraft looks like. But how would you communicate that, or how should we, as people who actually speak on social platforms, how do we communicate that to the Chinese, to the Russians, and to Southeast Asians, to Africans who have still a proper understanding of statecraft and all the things we have lost already, to tell them, look, we might come back. I mean, 20, 30, 40 years, but it will still get worse, but at some point it will get better. How should we manage this period of our own kind of utter incapacity?
Look, I am convinced that some individual countries in Europe still have some of these capacities. Not on the highest level, but they still have some remnants. And I hope that those individual countries, not only in Europe, by the way, if you check the just recent visit of the Prime Minister of Australia to China,
right,
you would see some statecraft, not the highest level, but statecraft and diplomacy, real. So the only way out of this situation, I think, for long term, very long term, is for Europe, it's on the individual member states level. Some member states can save something of confidentiality and something of the mutual confidence with China. There will be limitations, but you can work on that. And until the European Union is reformed fundamentally, structurally, or it gets through its demise, which is also a possibility. Until then, on the level of the European Union, on the European integration, this problem is not solvable. It will not be solved. We will have a further route of confrontation, of misunderstanding, of mismanagement in our relations with China, with Russia, with India, with everybody else who is part of the so-called global South or global East, if you want to differentiate.
It's just, yeah, as you said in the beginning, it's just an infuriating situation in which Europe still behaves as if though it was like 200 years ago and able to pee at everybody's leg and get away with it, when in fact now it's like it's not a big bulldog anymore. It's a small little poodle, and the poodle still thinks of itself as a bulldog, right? That's the infuriating part. The one question about your current prime minister, right, and Viktor Orban, because for all the grievances I have about him, one of the things he actually, in my view, did in a very diplomatic manner is he tried to bring back diplomacy with Russia. About a year ago, he was flying around and trying to get some form of negotiations going. He was heavily criticized inside the EU, inside NATO, but he did that. What's your assessment of like these individual leaders? And now, I mean, he's from your country, yes, but apart from that,
I think they do, not only Viktor Orban but also Robert Fico in Slovakia, who has a much weaker coalition. So his position inside the country is much more weaker than Viktor Orban's, but he still tries to have the basic rule of diplomacy, representing national interest, full stop. It's only about that. All the other elements of diplomacy are simple technology. How do you do that? So I think they are a kind of hope that Europe cannot fall into the total abyss, which we are moving forward. Yeah, and they may save some trust or some positive attitude in the world. But this action, this diplomatic activity of Orbán Viktor during the Hungarian presidency of the European Union showed very clearly that there are limitations. There are limitations for small countries. There are limitations for individual leaders from any country, by the way, because the whole situation, the general situation is bad. So what happened with this diplomatic activity, it simply run into walls everywhere. And now we see, by the way, with the recent developments that it is not so simple even. I am convinced that President Trump really wanted to have peace when he became president. During this diplomatic activity, Viktor Orban visited even Donald Trump. What remained out of that wish for peace in the case of Donald Trump? I think personally, his wish for peace is still there, but the circumstances may kill the best wishes. And the circumstances, I mean, the American internal political situation, the pressure from the Europeans, and so on. And what we see now that the Trump administration slips back to the Biden administration policy, except that Donald Trump does not want to pay for it. That's so simple. Somebody else shall pay for it. But basically, that's the limitation. So there are objective limits which you can try to push away a little bit. There are walls which you may push, but if you run into a wall with your head, you may hurt yourself, especially if you are the head of a small country, which is, by the way, not in the center of the European Union, but which is on the periphery. That's how it is.
Yes, and that's why it's so insanely dangerous to do this, because like I mean, Europe will suffer, the individual countries, the individual states, and especially the individual citizens will and already are suffering.
Thanks God there are brave people. It's dangerous, but some people are brave, or they have the mission to be brave, or maybe they don't have any other choice. I don't know. I don't have the information, but that's what happens. And thanks God, there are some people who are brave enough to go against the stream, to try to swim against the stream. At least they create some chance for limiting the damages.
Yeah.
Unavoidable damages which will come, which are coming very fast, not only with China, but with Russia, with India, with Brazil, with the whole global south. We are heading for even bigger damages for Europe.
Yeah, but the sad thing is that these ideologues who do these damaging things, this like running into walls, banging your head into a wall, they will blame their wounds on the wall. they constantly do, and they don't learn they're not the capacity is not there. So question then is like, do you think that there will be diplomacy again with China and with Russia?
Yes, most probably. I will not be alive when it comes back. I'm 65, so I don't plan to live 100 like Kissinger, or most probably I won't. But in due course, in due time, it will come back. It must come back. There is no other choice. What will be the price which we'll pay for this period? It may last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. God knows. The price will be enormous. But we'll have to pay for it. I mean, the political price, the diplomatic price, and so on. I am a little bit pessimistic, or as the joke tells, I am a well-informed. I am a well-informed optimist.
Switch off your devices, everybody. The world is more bearable if we don't see the train crash. Anyhow, we have to discuss again, Ambassador Kusai, and maybe also add a few more European diplomats who do see through this fog. But people who want to read more from you, where should they go?
Oh, it's very difficult. I publish mainly in Hungarian. I published a few articles in Germany. It was translated because I don't speak German, don't write German. So I am present in the Hungarian media from time to time, but I publish mainly in Hungarian. So for your international viewers, there will be a limitation for that. I am old. So I don't plan to be extremely active.
Ambassador Kusai, maybe we get to organize a panel, and we include Ambassador Jack Matlock, who's 30 years your senior.
Oh, okay. Okay, I understand. But you shall understand, I am a well-informed optimist, so I will join very happily, but for the longevity, I have limitations.
All right, but we hold on as long as we can. Ambassador Sandor Zoltan Kusai, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for your kind attention. Bye.